So this talk, I will start with why should we even talk about no self and insubstantiality. And then I'll spend some time on sort of talking about what insubstantiality isn't, because sometimes that's easier than talking about what it actually is. But I will try to talk a little bit also about what it actually is, and how we can approach it practically. Like, what can we do? How can we get closer to it? But also, before I start to talk, I sort of have to give a little bit of a caveat, because I'm using the medium of words here. And unfortunately, no matter what words I use, I won't be able to really explain it to you. Yeah, it's very much an experiential thing I'm talking about, not even a thing. And so what I'm doing, it's basically like I'm giving you some really bad directions. Yeah, it's sort of like you're asking me, how do I get to insubstantiality? And I'm like, yeah, go along this road, go past the bakery. If you see the gas station, you've gone too far. If you walk past the greenhouse, you've turned right too early. But then when you see the clearing, you're sort of in the area. So that's sort of what I'm doing here. So, but hopefully it will be helpful to you to maybe make a few steps towards I get a bit of an idea of how it relates to your experience. So, insubstantiality, Ratnaprabha just mentioned that this is one of 3 talks about the marks of what he called ordinary life, which is a really wonderful description. It's sometimes also called conditioned existence, or conditioned existence, and it's sort of our experience this side of enlightenment. And there are 3 of these marks. One is unsatisfactoriness, which is sometimes also called dukkha. Then we have impermanence, and the 3rd one is no self, or insubstantiality. And basically, when we really look at things, then we things, experiences, people, situation, phenomena, and then we do notice that they all to some degree have them. But this is not how we relate to the world. We relate to the world as if things, people, situations can give us ultimate happiness, as if they'll be permanent, at least the things we like. Or the things we really don't like also. Oh, why is it always here, always me? And also as if they have a fundamental inherent existence. So, and we do this loads and loads of times. Like, if the first bite of cake tasted good, there has to be a second slice. I've done a really wonderful few yoga classes. They were for free this week, and now I'm sort of projecting myself as this excellent yogi, because yoga is what's going to make me happy, clearly. And it's sort of a way how we create a lot of unhappiness and suffering for ourselves, because we fundamentally want from ourselves, from others, from situations, what they cannot deliver. And that's how we go around a circle of just creating more suffering for us and also for others. So what we're trying to do by reflecting on these 3 qualities is really, because it's quite easy on a rational level to be like, oh yeah, of course, everything's impermanent, like things don't last, they are unsatisfactory. But we're trying to go deep and really know them in our being, so we start relating differently to the world, so we're not causing ourselves and others so much suffering anymore. That's what we're trying to do here. And obviously one big part of that is no self and insubstantiality. So what we're looking for in all of this is what is sometimes called the taste of freedom. So the Buddha, there's this wonderful quote from the Buddha, The ocean has only got one taste, the taste of souls. So my teaching only has got one taste, the taste of freedom. So that's sort of our guiding light, what brings us closer to this taste of liberation, of freedom. And no self is one of these 3 marks of ordinary existence, and it's sort of probably the one that's most misunderstood, because it's so easy to misunderstand it. And it's been it goes, obviously it was explained loads by the Buddha. It was particularly important for the Buddha to make it really clear, because it's also one of the big sort of like doctrinal differences between Buddhism and Hinduism, for example. But it is something that is very, in a way, it's not becomes natural. It doesn't come natural to us. So what are we really, what is this no self? So it's not like we don't exist. So if I'm making some noises, you're receiving some noises, you're making sort of meaning out of that, yeah? So fundamentally, there is something here, but what isn't here is a sort of fixed and unchanging self. Yeah, so that's what we're really looking at. We're looking at the fact that there is no fixed and unchanging self. So what this obviously means is that there is something that's changing. Maybe sometimes it could be, I sometimes look at it as a sort of like bundle of habits. Anyway, but that's just one way of looking at it. And there are lots of reflections that people sort of can use to get a bit closer to the topic. So you might have come across some people like explaining it in terms of like quantum physics, and how like a lot of stuff is ultimately like waves and energy, and there isn't sort of any fixedness in that. But also a lot of things that sort of might have meaning, like, I don't know, this bowl, which is a singing bowl, which might be actually something that didn't have any particular meaning to you before you came to Buddhism, but now you recognize it as a singing bowl. I don't know, if you were a mouse or something, it wouldn't be a singing bowl to you, yeah? So it doesn't have an ultimate singing bowl-ness in itself, basically. And that's sort of some ways in which you can start playing around with how things are so fixed in your experience. So that it really depends on the context. You can also look at it in terms of like time. So for example, I was organizing a birthday party a few months ago. And obviously that involved like getting people together and organizing food. And then unfortunately, the day before I got COVID, so I had to cancel the birthday party. And it's sort of this thing where on one level, the party never existed, but on the other hand, it was quite a big part of my and other people's experience. So like, again, playing around with like, where is, the sort of like the sort of self, the substantiality of things and phenomena. Another slightly more poignant example, my grandfather died a few months ago, and there was definitely a moment not too long after his death where a lot of his affairs had already been sort of dealt with. And it sort of felt that his existence was merely a dream, and mine and my mother's experience in a way. So again, this really weird sort of interplay between being there and not being there, and the processness. So a friend of mine does actually sometimes call this so we're looking at the process-like experience of nature, and he calls this the changingness, which isn't really a word that you find in the Oxford Dictionary, but I find it quite helpful, the changingness, particularly if you drop it into meditation. So you can use reflections like that to just sort of start nudging your mind towards noticing that things are not actually quite as fixed as we make them to be. But in this area, we need to be really careful, because it's very easy to misunderstand it. And there are broadly two main ways in which one will misunderstand this teaching, this mark of ordinary existence. And so what we're trying to do is we're trying to walk a middle way between eternalism and nihilism. So eternalism, so for example, eternalism would be if, I guess, believing in a God can be a kind of eternalism. But also eternalism is a sort of subtle thinking that one or something of one's nature will always be there. Or more subtle, like if I do X, then Y will happen. If I just meditate, I'm just going to be more peaceful. I mean, hopefully some of that will happen, but it's not quite a linear process. So how we can misunderstand this is by sort of going into eternalism. Clearly, no self is trying to warn us against sort of eternalism, however subtle it is. But the other side, which is even more pertinent in a way, is nihilism. And nihilism, in a certain sense, is sort of like the false friend of no self. And I think it's particularly sort of prevalent in in our society, where there is a lot of like materialism. So if sort of it's not to think that, oh, we ultimately don't exist, so nothing really matters. And it's particularly, or like we're anyway going extinct very soon. So it's not, we're trying to not go down that route. On the contrary, Sangharakshita, the main teacher, or like the founder of our tradition, he said at one point, which is sort of one of my favorite quotes of him, in a universe perceived as dead, one actually stands no chance of enlightenment. Yeah. So if we're in a universe perceived as dead, one stands no chance of enlightenment. So this means, while the contradiction of eternalism and no self might be more obvious, actually nihilism is the much more tricky area. And then he goes on to say, obviously, if in a living universe we stand any chance of enlightenment depends on us. So, anyway, so, and this whole area of nihilism, I think particularly if one has a tendency to nihilism, it can sort of very subtly pair itself with sort of low self-esteem, self-hatred, and those sorts of areas, and that can be that leads us away from the taste of freedom. And that's something we need to watch out for when we look at insubstantiality. Because really what we want is we want to move to more freedom and more openness. So if you notice, ever sort of like while reflecting on it, that you're starting to feel a little bit down, then just stop what you're doing. And I mean, in all doubt, or like if you've got any doubts, just start with the metta bhavana. So that's why in that meditation earlier, at the end, I sort of suggested you notice how these reflection lands. That's really important to check in with you. So that's, I think, one of the, I guess, main ways in which no self or insubstantiality can be misunderstood. So we're walking on this, in this ravine, or on a tightrope in a way, the middle way between eternalism and nihilism. And we will all get it wrong at some points, like I get it wrong quite often. So it's really noticing where they come into our experience and then trying to come back to the middle way. I think there is another way in which we can really sort of go a bit wrong here. And that's, or what we need to take into account is the absolute reality and the relative reality. So when we talk about the fact that we all ultimately don't have a fixed and unchanging self, we're talking about the absolute reality to a degree. While we all in our daily lives also live the life in the relative reality of being an embodied person whose body is taking a particular shape in a particular society where certain things are sort of attributed to our bodies and our beings, and that plays out in a particular way. So what I mean, a way in which we can often reflect or sort of moving towards sort of like no self is by looking at, for example, group and other identities and trying to move away from those and become more of a true individual. But when we do this, we really need to keep in mind the absolute reality while working also on the level of our actual reality of our lives. Because if we don't do this, we end up with spiritual bypassing. So spiritual bypassing is when you're trying to sidestep, or actually the actual definition is sidestepping unresolved emotional issues or psychological wounds or developmental tasks. Yeah. So I think this is a really big, it is a really big issue. So we need to do the work in our life, which to a degree for some of us will also be psychological work, while keeping in mind the absolute reality of no self. We need to do both in a way. Otherwise we'll don't experience that freedom because we haven't processed some of the things we need to let go of in order to move forward. So it's almost like in order to let go of the self, we need to have a positive experience of ourselves in the first place. If we don't have that, we come from a place of not feeling enough or self-hatred, then we can't really let go in any meaningful way. And that's really important to know. So these are the two, I think, the two main ways in which one can go really wrong with like this whole no self insubstantiality area. Yes, so what is no self in the end? It's one of those really weird things where we're trying to describe something by what it's not. Like, hasn't even got an own word. It's sort of like no self. So when we're looking into this experience, the absence of a fixed and unchanging self, so that indicates that there is change or changingness, as my friend says. It also involves qualities like openness, aliveness, being a dynamic. So that's the sort of taste of the experience that we're looking for. And those of you who have come along to the other two talks in this series will have already learned that all these three marks of ordinary existence have a sort of door of liberation associated with them that you can go through, which is sort of, if you reflect on them deeply, the sort of particular angle or flavor of liberation you then approach. So for this one, it's shunyata, emptiness. So obviously that's another concept that can be a bit tricky because what emptiness doesn't sound very appealing, does it? It's also sometimes called the suchness, it's a sort of, a symbol for it is the blue sky of infinite potential. That's a symbol I really, really like. The blue sky of infinite potential. That's really quite beautiful to me. And yeah, it has these sort of like qualities of boundlessness and spaciousness and openness. So I think that's really, I think that's really important to keep in mind. These are the qualities that we're moving towards. So this particular taste of freedom is the one of openness, of infinite potential, because things are not fixed down. They could be anything. There is a sort of maybe a mild excitement or mysteriousness about that experience when one can come closer to it. So one way of approaching this could then be to just notice in your experience when these qualities are present and how that feels. Yes. So how do we then move towards insubstantiality and no self? Like, what practices, reflections can we do? And there are broadly two main schools or approaches to this topic. So one is called the analytical approach, and the other one is the synthetic approach, which doesn't mean artificial, it just means bringing things together. So one way, the more analytical approach, is sort of looking at your experience and consciousness, for example, in meditation, looking at your experience and looking at its constituent parts and seeing if there is actually a self, and really doing that quite experientially. So there's the traditional way of doing that is that one reflects on the 5 heaps or skandhas, which are form, feeling, perception, volition, and acts of consciousness. So one really that requires one to be in quite good conditions, probably a retreat condition where one already has done quite a lot of meditation, and then just go through these and see if there is anything that's a self or anything other than those. So that's one way one can do that. I would say it's not really for beginners because it does require quite a lot of concentration. And also because it's this sort of cutting and taking apart and analyzing approach, if you're a bit towards the nihilism side of things, it can be a bit unhelpful because you can end up being like, oh, there is nothing left. So another way of looking at this is more the sort of synthetic approach of looking at conditions and conditionality. So again, there are particular formal meditations that you can do, but this is something you can actually introduce in your everyday meditation. So you could look at the sort of changingness, the process-like aspect of experience. You can look at that. But even outside of meditation, you can reflect on the conditions that are at play. For example, you could reflect on the conditions, the many conditions that have brought you here today. So for me, that would include being born in a place where the Buddha's teachings have been passed on, where one can practice a religion freely, where I have met the Buddha's teachings, where I have had the friends and teachers that helped me to learn and understand the Dharma, where I have found this Buddhist center, which involved moving to a different country, where I have been invited to discuss, and the beauty of that is that once you start reflecting in this way, gratitude is actually at your fingertips. So it can be a very, very positive exercise of really looking at conditions and how they play out, and what has sort of led to a particular situation. And you can also do that with difficult situations or unpleasant situations. And again, then it's sort of less fixed, less personal. So that is a reflection one can do even outside of meditation. So yeah, and yeah, so I think these are the two main ways we can approach the topic: analytical or synthetic. And a really good way of doing it within the meditation is to look at the changing of how our experience constantly changes, and outside of meditation on how conditions impact on our life. Yeah. So these are some ways we can approach the topic. And yeah, it can still be a little bit of a daunting process. But another quote from Sangharakshita, the founder of this movement, is that not that we never have a self, but we always have a new self. And if each new self is a better one than the last, we can say that spiritual progress has been made. So I find that is quite encouraging. So I think that's a level every one of us can practice on. And obviously, when we talk about a new self and a better self than the one before, what we really mean is more skillful, more ethical. Yeah. So that's what we're working towards. Because to make it a bit more concrete, another symbol of what we're trying to move towards is the self-transcendence of the Bodhisattva. So somebody who is an enlightened being and has vowed to practice until all beings are liberated. Yeah. So the self-transcendence of this really high idea of going until everybody is liberated, and making steps towards that. So that's in a way another symbol of this no self, this particular flavor that we're sort of working towards, that particular flavor of liberation. Yes. And just checking if I forgot anything. And then obviously in the meditation, there was also, I invited you to just notice if there is a sense of self present, and if it's strong or not so strong, and what does it consist of. So that is a reflection. You could, when you feel quite absorbed, you could sort of do that sometimes, like don't get too caught up about it. But I think occasionally it's quite a nice reflection to do. And then you might notice things like that if your sense of self is very activated, there is a lot of tension in your body. That's something that you might sometimes notice. But see for yourself. And then I have mentioned another way of approaching as looking at particular identities, but also maybe particular views that we hold and questioning those. So that's another way we can approach the topic. Yeah, so this was my sort of short outline of basically why should we bother with no self, and how does it fit into these 3 marks of ordinary existence? Where can we go wrong? So trying to avoid eternalism and nihilism, trying to avoid spiritual bypassing. I was trying to describe a little bit what we're moving towards. So there we have the qualities like openness, infinite potential, but also we have the symbol of the Bodhisattva. the enlightened being. And I've mentioned a few ways in which we can sort of introduce some of that reflection inside and outside of meditation. And now I would like to close with a poem, which I really like, and which I think also for me sort of puts into words some of that experience. It's a poem by Sangharakshita, and it's not very long. It's called Above Me Broods. Above me broods a world of mysteries and magnitudes. I see, I hear, more than what strikes the eye or meets the ear. Within me sleep potencies deep, unfathomably deep, which, when awake, the bounds of life, death, time, and space will break. Infinity. Above me, like the blue sky, do I see. Below, in me, lies the reflection of infinity.